Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to this meeting on the City Development Plan 2022 to 2028. Every 6 years in the City of Dublin, we articulate our vision of how the city is going to look like for the next 6 years. We look at how we're going to develop our infrastructure, how we're going to develop a healthy, vibrant, progressive city. And we have, on this particular occasion, to look at a whole raft of new challenges that are facing us. We've never had a pandemic like this before. We've never had Brexit before. And of course, we have to really get to grips with climate change. So I have a very expert panel here tonight to look into some of those issues. But before I introduce the panel, I'd like to make a short presentation on an overview of what we're going to do. It's going to be very quick, and it's taken from Dublin City Council's own presentation. So here we go. The Dublin City Development Plan, the introduction to the review process. It has been prepared by Dublin planners themselves. And the next, we got the next slide there. So first of all, there's the requirements for the development plans. We have to go by the planning acts. There's core strategy, the zoning, land itself, provision of infrastructure, conservation, environmental protection, culture, and a host of other issues that we have to look into. And the Planning Act itself specifies other areas that we have to be compliant with. Remember, it's not just a plan for Dublin, it's broader. We have to take into consideration the national planning framework, we have to look at the regional side of it, and we have to look at the local side of it in terms of transport and in terms of all of the special issues that are guidelines that are given by the Minister in relation to height and density, etc. And the development plan guidelines also come from the Department of Housing and Local Government. And they, of course, we have to be compliant with all of these as well as doing our own plan specifically to deal with Dublin. The next slide. This is what's different this time then. These are new elements: the National Development Plan, the Regional Spatial Plan, the Ministerial Directives, and the various housing requirements. Firstly, then we have the role of the Office of the Planning Regulator. We had no planning regulator before this. Now we have a planning regulator who will check to see that our plans are in order. COVID, of course, is a major challenge in terms of how we're going to see our city centre, the whole retail, culture, everything to do with the way we live. Look at the future of LDAs, that's Land Development Agency, and of course then there's going to be a greater emphasis on climate change. So this is the new context that we have to develop our plan in. The next slide. The process. What's the process of this development? Well, while the plan is going to be for a 2-year period, you can see that the review has already started, 15th of December, and there's the 4 key stages. Firstly, we have a pre-draft stage, which we're right in the middle at the moment, and that is ended by the 22nd of February. And this is why we're having our particular meeting at the present time. We have to have a look at the broad policies, the overview, the vision. Secondly, then we get the draft development plan itself together and look at submissions there. Thirdly, there's material amendments that come from the city councillors. And fourthly, we adopt the plan. So it's quite a comprehensive process, and it's quite a comprehensive plan. Hello? Yeah. Have we got all of that? Was I muted for some time there?
You're muted only for about 10 seconds.
10 seconds, that's good. Well, can we have the final one there is the process. Yeah, so we come now to the headline issues. These are the main themes. Climate change is really at the top there, implementation of the National Framework Plan and the Regional Spatial Plan. We have to balance that with compact growth, protect amenities, high quality mixed use neighbourhoods, which is really after my own heart. urban villages. That's one of the key areas that I'm very interested in. We move to the next slide. Housing supply essential for social affordable markets provided, the regeneration of neighbourhoods, community and culture, the investment, growth, height and densification, and the protection of a world-class heritage city, which is Dublin. Then finally, we are supporting and expanding green infrastructure and the biodiversity of the city itself. Employment and retail, the city has to be taken over, otherwise it's not a living city. Planning for a post-COVID environment, what plans need to be made at this stage. And finally, the movement, transport, public realm, and quality of public spaces. So these are a few of the themes that we'll be addressing here tonight, and we can put the slides away now. So that's a very brief overview that, by and large, I put it together. Part of it was provided by Dublin City Council as to the way that they see that it is, but I put some variations in it as well. So we have a great panel here tonight to discuss that. So first of all, we'll start with our speakers. That would take 5 to 6 minutes apiece, and then we'll move on to questions, answers. So we can articulate and expand on various issues during the course of the discussion. My first speaker is Jack Gilligan. Jack is the former arts officer for Dublin City Council, and indeed he was the very first person to hold that role. And he's also chairman of the Five Lamps Art Festival, so he's right in the heart of Dublin, and he's on a number of art groups and theatre groups. Now, I spoke to Jack before, and Jack told me that while A is for arts, and it's the first letter of the alphabet, but that he had very often to go down to the bottom of the alphabet before he came across arts and in the agenda. So that's why I've decided that he's going to be the first speaker tonight. Arts is number one. Jack, off you go.
Thank you, Joe. And that's so true. And I think things are beginning to change, thankfully. And, you know, drawing up a new development plan is an ideal opportunity to sort of put the arts and culture in the place it should be, and to provide the infrastructure to sustain the arts and culture in the city. And, you know, we talk about community and culture are inextricably linked and should be, in the same way that we make provision for housing and traffic and roads and everything, and sports and recreation. We should be making provision for arts and culture. And I suppose Joe mentioned about the past year and the changes that have come about and what we've learned. And I think certainly during the past year, we have begun to appreciate our artists and what they have to offer, and how they can enhance life for all the citizens. We saw and heard, don't know if I'm still on or not.
Yes, you're going fine, Jack.
Okay, yeah. I've gone off my own screen, but anyway, we began to appreciate what artists can do for us, and how we saw how in the lockdown, how they rose to the occasion so wonderfully and managed to create uplifting work for us, whether it was Glenn Hansard giving a performance from his home, or theatre companies streaming plays into our homes, or musicians performing in the gardens of nursing homes. We now realize just how much artists have to give and how bleak life would be without them. So I've always considered that the arts are a quality of life issue. And indeed, our revered president, Michael D. Higgins, once referred to access to the arts as being a human right. One of our most respected and talented actors I was talking to recently, and he said, or he wrote, I think theatre in itself is healing. It's an explosive expression of humanity. It's something we are all touched by. Now, the city development plan should provide the infrastructure for artists to create the work, to enhance the lives of citizens, and to provide the infrastructure where citizens can interact with the artists and their work. So space is a major consideration and has been for years and years. And when I say space in the city, I mean right throughout the city, including in communities all over the city. One of the most pressing needs of artists is a decent space in which to work, and often a space in which to live. Artists' workspaces are required all over the city, as I've said, and because of the nature of the earnings of artists, which is often sporadic, they really very often find it extremely difficult to get decent accommodation. And I believe the development plan should make provision for artists' workspace and accommodation. This could be included in housing developments by a small tweak in the design of accommodation. Artists often work in group spaces, and usually these are very inadequate and cramped very often. So the provision for groups of well-designed studios should be considered. The experience of the past year suggests that the city centre may well indeed, as Joe has mentioned, be a changed place in the future. And maybe there will be more unused spaces in the city. And I think consideration should be given to converting some such spaces into workspaces for artists. And when I say artists, I don't just mean painters or sculptors. I mean any artists. It could be theatre people or dancers or whatever. But now is the time to consult with all the various artists or organizations to determine their needs and how best they can be met if possible. I'm aware that for example, major plans for the redevelopment of a cultural quarter in Parnell Square have been drastically cut back. So I think that's unfortunate and should be revisited. There is a scarcity of performance spaces in the city. A lot of small theatre companies find it almost impossible to get places to perform at a reasonable cost. And indeed, one small theatre in the city was threatened with closure about 2 years ago, purely for lack of funding. And I mean, it was one of the few places within the city where smaller and new theatre companies could go with a chance of actually performing. So I think we need to look at that and talk to the theatre sector and find out what is required and to see if it can be met, and it should be met if possible, because these people and the work they do is so important to the quality of life in the city. So again, I would advocate consultation with all the sectors to try and make provision where it's possible at all, because they are vital to life in the city. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. Well, that raises some very interesting questions about how we treat our artistic community in terms of work, in terms of living space, in terms of performance space, and how we can integrate that into the provisions for the new development plan. Well, part of that applies to our next speaker, who will be dealing with housing. Obviously, a place to live and a place to work are very important. And our next speaker is Councillor Alison Gilliland. Alison is chair of the Dublin City Council's Strategic Policy Committee on Housing, and she is absolutely innovative in terms of dealing with land use and coming up with ideas in relation to the best use of the local authorities' land. So she's leading the way there, and we'd like to hear her views now. Alison.
Thanks very much, Joe, and thanks for the opportunity to speak on this very important topic. It is something that we at Dublin City Council level give a lot of consideration to, and we want the public to give equal consideration to it as well, because everyone has a voice in this. I do have a presentation. Thank you very much, Carl. I'm going to talk about specifically the housing and community aspect of it. And you can go to the next slide there, Carl. Thank you. I suppose when we think of housing, everybody wants to put a roof over their head and wants to have a home. And I think we've all come to have a better realization of what that home means, given that many of us are now using it not only to live in, but also to work in. And we're also conscious of those who don't have homes or whose homes aren't adequate. So our view would be to have sustainable placemaking. That is not just a home, it's your home and your community. And one of the things we are looking to do is that we would have an evidence-based practice when it comes to needs, housing needs. And we know there's a significant need in Dublin City Council jurisdiction. And I'm not just talking for social housing, but also for housing to rent and housing to buy. Family sizes have decreased over the years, so we need to be conscious of what size, how many bedrooms we need to put in the houses we plan. And now that there's a shift towards remote working or working from home, do we need to accommodate that phenomenon as well? I mentioned type there, and by that I mean whether it be a house, as we've all, a lot of us probably grown up in houses, but we see a shift now to apartment living, particularly given that we have to maximize the land that we have. And there's very little land left in the city, and we need to be more innovative when it comes to maximizing its use. Tenure, as I said, social housing, but also for rent and for sale. And affordability is a massive issue for us. I always say we don't have a housing crisis, we have an affordable housing crisis. And we need to look at how, as a city council, and indeed how central government can support people who are struggling to afford the high rents of the market, or who wish to buy, how they might be able to buy more affordably. So we don't talk about housing in isolation, but it is very much within the community, the amenities and the infrastructure and services. So whether that be your public services of health, education, social services, your green spaces for recreation, sports, and just plain green enjoyment, indoor spaces, generational, intergenerational uses, communities can come together, have activities for young people, old people, or all people together. We need to also think about our transport interconnectivity and employment opportunities. And I think Jack has also highlighted the need for cultural spaces there. And there are, next slide please, Carl, a few overarching concepts that we're looking at as well. And if Carl goes to the next slide, I'll talk about them. Thank you. Yeah, I mentioned there the land crisis we have, that we have very little land left upon which to build, and we have a high demand for housing. So one of the key considerations is how can we progress compact growth? So we're looking at heights, densities, the use and the reuse of buildings and lands. And height can be a very controversial issue. Generally in our development plan, we would look at the various areas and we would tailor heights to the area, whether that be as urban area, suburban area, near areas of connectivity such as DART stations. However, those well-laid plans can often be overridden by national legislation such as the urban form and height guidelines, and that's a particular concern for us, that while we put a lot of time and energy into good sustainable planning, national legislation doesn't always respect that. With regard to the use and the reuse of buildings and lands, so as part of the process, we're looking at perhaps commercial sites. Might they be better rezoned into a mixed use so that you could get some housing on them? Lands as well. We've brownfield sites. We have maybe underused industrial sites around the city. So it's looking at those and how can we maximize their use for housing and community, but still remembering that we need to have employment opportunities within local areas. So interconnectivity, and this is to do with height as well, the relationship of housing and community with the existing shapes. And a lot of the time, people who are living in a more suburban, your typical terrace estate, and there is a proposal to put an 8, 10, 12-story building in that vicinity. And that's where we get tensions. And I think that's where we need to have reasonable conversations around how that interconnectivity and that relationship with existing spaces can be respected. I mentioned previously about the relationship between our home and the outdoor realm, particularly during COVID. And while we do have lots of pockets of green space, I would argue that a lot of the time they're underutilized. They're just there, and people don't really sit in them because there's no benches or there's no biodiversity there. So I think that's one of the challenges we have, how we can enhance those green spaces around and connect the home better with our outdoor realm. The other challenge we have is when it comes to intergenerational living and planning for all stages of life and family life, from the people who have families and then the families fly the nest and they're older and they're left perhaps in a bigger house and they don't want to move out of the community into a small apartment. So how can we plan to allow everyone live their life cycle in the same community if that's something that they wish? The other concept that we're looking at is the 15-minute city, and the idea that all your key services would be within a 15-minute walk of where you live. So that's your school, health, a bus to your employment if needed. And one of the challenges that we're looking at the moment in Santry is exactly this. While we've got a lot of development happening in Santry, we don't have the schools or the doctor, surgery and the medical facilities that might be able to support all of that. So how can we, when we get planning applications in, particularly through the strategic housing development, how can we make sure that it's fitting in a way that supports sustainable community? And of course, the environmental and climate challenge, where our building materials, energy and heating is more climate friendly. We build up biodiversity spaces in our communities and we reduce the carbon heavy transport footsteps. So in the next slide, I have identified 5 challenges. 2 there I have mentioned, and it's the urban form and height guidelines and the strategic housing development planning process, that it comes from central government down, and more or less it rides roughshod over our development plan. So how can we square that circle where we at local level are customizing our planning to local communities, but there's a tension there with national legislation. When it comes to reusing or maximizing sites already in the city, and I'm particularly thinking of the city centre, there is a huge cost to infill housing. I'm thinking of a site perhaps there on Fishamble Street, and we've been quoted in order to put 5 or 6 apartments in there would cost over 400,000 each. Now you can argue that's a very high price, but if you look at the holistic value that you have everything, your services on site, it does bring the long-term cost down, but still it is a cost. Community infrastructure should be seen as an investment in communities and an investment in sustainability. But when we go at Dublin City Council level to build particularly affordable rental or affordable purchase, the cost of community infrastructure is incorporated into the overall cost of the development, and that pushes up the affordability. Lack of congruence between apartment design and family living. I know many of us here as public reps, when families get an allocation, they say, I don't want an apartment, I don't want a flat, I want a back garden. And I think we really have to look at how we're designing apartments to allow families to live more cohesively there, particularly with private outdoor space and safe, secure areas for their children to play. And then encouraging employment in local and more suburban areas. I'm thinking particularly here of an area like Balmain and Clongriffin, where you could argue that during the day it is almost like a ghost town because there's no employment opportunities there. And I think we really need to look at how we can encourage employment in, so people don't have to get in their car and drive into the city centre or the big industrial estate, that we could have more opportunities on our doorsteps. And I think perhaps COVID has made us realise that there are possibilities there for working more remotely or more locally. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alison, and thank you for that. There's questions coming in already on housing, so that's obviously a very hot topic, and you'll have an opportunity of coming back on those. Our next speaker is Andrew Montague. Andrew is a former Lord Mayor of Dublin, and he's probably most famous for his introduction of the very successful Dublin bike scheme. And it's hard to believe it now, but that's 10 years ago, I think 2010. Is that right, Andrew? And he is our resident expert on climate change. Andrew.
Sorry, turning on the off the mute button there.
Good. Hear you now.
Okay, can you see the?
Yes, we can see it, Andrew.
Very good, that's great. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and how it impacts and how we should try and impact climate change in our development plan. And just to put things in context, I just thought I'd show you where the emissions in Ireland come from so that we know what it is we have to tackle. The extraordinary thing is that 35% of our emissions in Ireland come from agriculture. And that's not even going down, that's going up. And it just shows what a challenge we have in Ireland, how we are failing so badly in trying to deal with climate change because we are making no progress in the whole agricultural sphere. That's nothing to do with our development plan, but it just puts things into context and, you know, the uphill battle we have if we're going to tackle climate change from Ireland's point of view. Industry is next at about 26% of our emissions, transport at 24%, and residential emissions are at 14%. And most of the residential emissions is actually home heating. And so that's going to be a real challenge for us, because in order to tackle emissions from home heating, we're going to have to go back and retrofit every home in Ireland, essentially, including blocks of apartments, and we'll have decisions to make. Is it better to knock those or to regenerate them or renovate them? It's going to be enormously expensive. It's going to cost tens of billions of euros to retrofit all the homes in Ireland. And that's a massive challenge we're going to face over the next 10 to 20 years. The government is talking about doing 500,000 homes between now and 2030. I think that's extraordinarily ambitious, and I certainly wish them well on that. But the practicalities of doing it is going to be a massive problem for us. One option that we do have, I think, in Dublin to look at is the use of energy from industrial production, like the incinerator here. And if we can get that energy into people's homes, that's something that is, I know the City Council is looking at, but we need to move that on and you know, heat people's homes from it. Normally that heat just goes to waste, and we can divert that into people's homes. That's something that's done widely in Europe, especially in the Nordic countries. We should be doing it here in Dublin. The other big area that we can do something about in Dublin, and I think probably the area we can most tackle, is our transport emissions. And as Joe mentioned, it's something I have championed for years, is the idea of cycling. I proposed the Dublin bike scheme long before anybody thought bike schemes were feasible. There was only one successful bike scheme in the world at that stage, that was in Copenhagen, and I had seen how they had overcome so many of the challenges of running a bike scheme, that I knew there were answers to a lot of the questions that people had. So that's why I proposed the bike scheme. But the interesting thing to me is that the Dublin bike scheme is one of the 2 most successful bike schemes in the world in terms of the number of bikes that are used per day. Typically, each bike is used at least 10 times per day. And so that says to me that we should be expanding this scheme and expanding it rapidly. Now, when we first introduced the scheme, there were 450 bikes. Alan Kelly, a few years later, provided the funding to triple it. We went up to 1,500 bikes. That was in 2012, round about then. And since then, for the last 8 or 9 years, nothing much has happened. There's maybe been 100 or so bikes added in the last 10 years. So there's an opportunity. We could easily double the number of bikes. It wouldn't cost much money. I just don't understand why that's not happening. It's a very simple thing. And cycling in general, the Labour Party set up the cycling committee in Dublin City Council. I chaired it for 10 years. We tripled the number of people cycling across the city, and we've a lot more to do in that area. Another important thing, if you're going to reduce emissions from transport, is to make sure that we make our city permeable. And that's a big fancy name, but it means make it easy to get around. So if you're living in a cul-de-sac here, and say, for example, you wanted to go to a shop around the corner, or even if there was a Lewis stop there, you wanted to use public transport. If you've all of these cul-de-sacs and you can't get from one part of the city to another easily walking, well, then people don't bother using the Lewis. They say, well, I may as well get in my car. It's too much hassle. That could be a mile to walk around. So a 2-minute walk, it could be a 20-minute walk to your local Lewis stop if you don't have a permeable city. So when we design our cities, we should have much more of a design pattern like this so that people can get around the city and make use of public transport, encourage them to walk, encourage them to cycle. So again, if you're living here, it should be, if you've got a permeable city, it's very hard or very easy to move around the city. Another way to make it easy or to reduce our transport emissions is to encourage mixed development. So here's an example of non-mixed development. This is an industrial estate out in Santry, and my wife Sinead worked here for a while. And when they're working in an industrial estate like this, simple things like lunch, if you're going for your lunch, there's just nowhere to go for lunch here. So everybody, you get an hour's break, everybody would have to pile in the car. They'd go 15 minutes up to Swords to get to the Airside Industrial Estate, queue up, get your lunch. You kind of get 10 minutes to wolf it down, and everybody back in the car, back down to your office. Whereas when the office relocated into Ballymun, into the civic offices in Ballymun, you can walk out your door and make use of all of the facilities in the area, the shops, some of the cafes and that. And that not only is a great benefit to all the people working there, it reduces the amount of driving they do, but then because you have office workers in the town of Ballymun, it means then there's more facilities for the residents there. So everybody benefits when you've got a mixed use development like that. So we should try and locate office space in our town centres, places like Santry and in the city centre as well. Alison was talking there about density. And again, if we want to reduce the amount of walking people do, we have to have people, a lot of people living in the one area so that they can support the local shops and walk to bus stops, walk to Lewis stops, as I was talking about. But density isn't always about going high. Here's some streets that you would recognize, Joe, in your own area there. And that would be one of the highest density parts of the city. And it's only 2 stories. We don't need to go 10, 15 or 20 stories high. And in fact, when you look at those bigger buildings, those taller buildings, in terms of climate emissions, they are much harder to heat and worse again, they're very difficult to cool in the summer. They use an enormous amount of energy to cool them in the summer. So they're not energy efficient at all. And yet you can get very high densities with your 2- and 3-story terraced housing. But part of the reason why those terraced housing, we were able to get so many people living in a small area was because when they were built, they weren't thinking about cars and they didn't provide car parking space. And I think that's the way we have to think now. We shouldn't be, streets are getting pushed apart and houses are getting pushed apart because we're putting so much energy or using so much space to provide car parking. Let's go back to the old way, forget about providing the car parking and just allow people to live like in much more attractive circumstances like we have in Stony Batter. What about electric cars and transport? Are they going to be the answer to all of our problems with emissions? Well, I think they will play a role. There's no doubt about it. Electric cars are much more energy efficient and produce far less emissions than combustion engines do. No doubt about that. But if we rely on electric cars to answer our emissions problems, we're going to run into massive problems of congestion, because electric cars are very cheap to run. And people will say, oh, well, I'll just pop in the car and I'll drop down to the shops. It's so cheap to run the car. And we could end up with very, very severe congestion. So although they produce less emissions, they won't solve our congestion problems, and they will not be the answer to Dublin's transport problems. A step in the right direction, but not the answer. How about electric bikes? I think electric bikes are going to have a big role to play. One of the things that surprised me is that people who have electric bikes cycle more frequently than people who ride regular bikes, because they're just so easy. Not only do they cycle more frequently, they commute to work more often, they go further. So I think electric bikes are going to have a big role to play. They're very space efficient for the city. It's a great way for people to get around. And I think as they take off, which they're taking off very rapidly at the moment, they're going to be a game changer in our city. And I think we should be preparing in our development plans for people to commute longer distances. On an electric bike, it's not a big deal to cycle from Swords to the city centre, for example, whereas on a push bike, you'd have to be quite the athlete to do it, I suppose. So I think electric bikes are going to make a difference, and we have to make the most of that. So they're just some of the issues I wanted to touch on climate change, just a quick run through that area, and I'd be interested in any questions that anybody has.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That's fantastic. Thank you. And certainly gives us a lot of food for thought. Stoneybatter could well be a model area with its low rise, but extremely dense and a very friendly community. And Dublin City Council did a survey of it recently and discovered that 60% of the population don't have cars. That's the highest area for lack of cars in the city. So let's move on to Senator Marie Sherlock. You would probably know Marie Sherlock. She's a Labour Party senator. She's spokesperson, Labour Party spokesperson on employment, and she's an economist with SIPTU. So she's going to speak to us tonight about employment and about working conditions in the city. Thank you, Marie.
Thanks, Joe, and delighted to be able to contribute to this discussion tonight. And I think the first thing to say is that I think if you're to say the phrase the city development plan to most people, and if they're to see the big tomes, the 2 volumes and all the documents that go with it, you know, people's eyes glaze over. But it's such an important document. It's such an exciting an important opportunity to be able to reimagine the city and what the city, what our city should look like for all that live here, for all that work here, for all that want to come here. And I suppose I'm particularly excited because I think there's a very real opportunity now, given the political composition of the council, to be able to put a real mark or put in place key changes and a very clear vision for how we want the city to develop. And Joe asked me to talk about the employment dimension to the city tonight. And interestingly, I'm employment affairs spokesperson for the party, but I also have arts, culture, media, agus and Gaeltacht as well. And Jack talked earlier about the need for space, working space and creative space and residential and of course a place to live for artists. And so one of the big things in the city is that how do we make Dublin a livable city, a city where people can work and comfortably live? And I think when we say a livable city, we automatically think about, you know, putting in place the proper services and resources. So in terms of sufficient and affordable housing, in terms of adequate transport, accessible transport, in terms of childcare, and of course all the other things that go around that. But I think one of the things that is missing often in a debate about, or you know, when we're trying to set up the vision of a livable city, is that key issue of income. And what do people earn in a city? So it's not enough to say, you know, we need jobs, we need and any job will do. it's actually about decent and quality jobs. And I suppose if I were to say anything about previous development plans and what I hope maybe might be different in this future development plan, and this is not, because obviously there's been such good content in the previous development plans, such a focus on employment, but we've thought of employment and communities in silos, and we need to think of them as one. And so I suppose my point this evening really is about that, rather than just saying we need to attract jobs and then think about the service around them, we actually need to be able to think, well, if people have jobs, to what extent can they do the heavy lifting in terms of affording accommodation in the city, in terms of being able to contribute to their local community by being able to use the local cafes and shops and whatever else. And so in particular, when we look at the conversation around the North Inner City and the Northeast Inner City over the last decade and the establishment of the task force, we've seen very large numbers of money put into improving the security, put into the physical infrastructure there. But we haven't had that conversation about the livelihoods of those who live in the North Inner City. And in particular, there's a huge emphasis on unemployment, but the majority are working. Yet when we look at what they're working in, we see that there is a disproportionately high number who are involved in what we might call elementary skilled or semi-skilled work. So it's either in retail, it's in the hospitality sector, and there was a time that these were good jobs. They commanded a decent income that people could pay for adequate accommodation for themselves and their family. And we know that so much of that work now is minimum wage. So to give you one example, and perhaps the councillors might take this on board in terms of when the plan is being developed, is that there's a proposal now to have a cultural or a tourist area in the North Docklands. But to me, one of the things that we can, and in some ways to attract tourists down to the North Docks and talk about the wealth of culture there with regards to the dockers and the life that went with that. But we have to bring that into the 21st century and say, well, actually, those who are working to provide that tourist experience, will they have decent employment themselves? So I want the North Docks to become an area, a destination for decent employment, as well as a destination for tourists. And so if we begin to think like that with city council initiatives, that we have a twin benefit of both generating employment, but also ensuring that employment is decently paid. And to be fair, and I know the Labour Party has been absolutely to the fore in terms of social clauses, ensuring that they have been embedded in city development plans. But I suppose is to be able to broaden that out now, to make sure that plans, like the tourist experience that is proposed, doesn't progress unless it has a very clear commitment at the heart of it to decent employment for those who'll be working in it. So the second key thing I just wanted to raise this evening is with regards to, if we think about employment and quality jobs, and a matter close to my own heart is the provision of adequate childcare. And particularly in the constituency that we're in, there is a huge shortage of adequate childcare facilities in Dublin 1, Dublin 3 and Dublin 7. And there's two needs here. Obviously for families where in particular the mother wants to go out to work, and yet we don't have the childcare facilities available to meet the demand. But secondly, particularly in the most disadvantaged communities in our constituency, unless we ensure that there is adequate childcare and provision, because the role of childcare in the most disadvantaged part of our constituency is absolutely enormous in helping families, in helping babies from the youngest of age and small kids to break out of that cycle of poverty, of disadvantage, of discrimination. And so we need to ensure that the resources go into those facilities. And I know many of them are crying out for money, but I think we need to have a very clear section in the development plan that talks about the central role of childcare and family resource centres as being vital to breaking the cycle of poverty and disadvantage within our most disadvantaged communities. So look, I want to leave you at that. I think I very much look forward to the rest of the speakers, and obviously happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Senator Marie Sherlock. And you've raised very important questions that if we're going to have a living city, it must be a working city, and it must be proper conditions, proper pay and proper conditions, and not to be existing on the minimum wage. And likewise, the importance of having family facilities and childcare facilities if we're going to again have families living at the heart of the city. So thank you for that. I'm sure there'll be loads of questions coming up on it. And now we move on to Audryn Reid, who is a lecturer in planning. And Audryn is chair of the planning programme in the new Technological University of Dublin. And he is a local development specialist. Audryn. Audryn, you're on mute.
Yeah, on mute first, always do that part. I think if Jack could stick that up for us, or somebody could stick it up for you. Right, thanks very much. What I'm going to talk about, you can move to the next slide there, if that's okay. I'm going to talk about is just the process of the development plan piece, and then the key issues that are involved in it. I think Joe has already covered one or two of these points, but the thing to remember with the development plan, like it lasts for 6 years, but after 4 years, you start a whole renewal process. So you're not finished one when you're planning the other. And that whole process in that 2 years is completely and utterly covered by legislation. So every part of that process is already mapped out, and there is no room for deviation. Okay, so once it starts, the local authority is on a treadmill, and it actually has to go through at a fairly fast pace, considering what's going to be. If we get the next slide. Again, this is a slide that came from the from Dublin City Council, but there are 4 stages, 4 key stages, but in total, there are 12 stages to the development plan. And literally over 2 years, who can do what and when, and how quick the manager has to respond, all laid down in legislation. For people who want to make a direct input into this development plan, the first 2 stages are critically important. The pre-draft consultation, which is out now until the 22nd of February, allows you to say anything you want and give your opinion on everything. From that, the City Council planners will do a draft plan, which will actually come out in November. So it's quite a period of time. It's a really detailed document, and the clock starts ticking here. At that stage, it's open to the general public to write in and say, I don't like this, I'd rather you do this, or put something else in, and as many submissions as practically possible. After that, it then goes back to the elected members. And if you want to do anything subsequent to the phase 3 and 4 here, you actually have to go through your elected representatives. And even there, when you're making amendments, you can only amend the amended pieces. Okay, if we go to the next stage. The plan is made up of a number of things. And I'm going to go through each of these so we can skip this slide if we can go on to this one. I will go on to just say, Maria, so 4 volumes to this plan. I know I carried loads of them and they're incredibly heavy. But inside this, there is a core strategy. And here it gives a vision for what the whole plan is about. And a lot of people miss that the concept of this is a vision for a city. Okay, it's a vision that's designed for 6 years. But in the background of that vision is something that goes on over 20 years. Okay. Now, it's also limited by a whole range of things, and we'll talk about them shortly. If we go to the next slide. Yeah. The key to this, and one whole volume, is of maps. They look incredible, and they're incredibly complex when it comes to a city. And this is the city centre side, which is the most complex of them all. All of these have a color code. And if you're getting one of these maps, you'll have the color code beside it. I didn't include it now, only cut a section of this. But what you'll see here are things that are community services, which are retail, which is all the blue because it's the city centre, kind of greeny blue. And then you have these things called SDRA, Strategic Development Regeneration Areas. And this is where the city has to identify what it wants to do in a specific area and to try and build it up. And every so often, they'll pick on a couple of key locations. Generally speaking, some of these locations survive 2 and 3 development plans because developing them takes a period of time. So much can be done in a 6-year period. Another thing you'll see here is a bit of shading out around the river and a couple of other key locations, which are little red marks all over, which basically means that the council doesn't want any proposals on this section. They want that left alone and don't interfere. So it's a matter of doing things and stopping things happening. So the development plan really works in multiple ways. If we can move to the next bit. Then we go to what we have policies and procedures, and these are critically important. This is where the councillors and the planning officials put in things that say what we want to happen, okay, what we don't want to happen, and how we're going to do some of these things. So again, there's a lot of discussion and debate, and a lot of the amendments that will come in and people's views will come into these particular areas. They carry enormous weight. And if you're a developer coming to the city and you're looking what's possible, this tells you what's possible and it tells you what's not possible. We can move to the next slide. In a 6-year plan, you think it's a long period of time, but in the life of a city, it's a really short window, okay? Think of this in terms of what you want to deliver for your city for 20 years. And that 6-year component fits into a 20-year plan. So sometimes you're saying, I want this to happen in 6 years, but I want to do this so something can happen in 10 years and in 20 years' time. If you think back 20 years ago to the year 2000 and what the city was like then, it would just started to pick up after years of economic decline, and development was only starting to kick off. We had huge amounts of vacancies, we still do, but so much has happened in that 20-year period. And now think of what it might be like in 20 years' time, if we do it properly, okay? And the development plan is trying to ensure that we do it properly. Now, there's a lot of other things that happened around this that actually make things not happen properly, or other things, and we could talk about them another time. But this development plan frames your future. It frames how you think and what you think is going to be important to you. So the issue like Jack has raised about the arts suddenly becomes critically important. Otherwise, all that space that might be empty can be taken up by anything else and you forget the arts. So we'll move on to the next slide. The development plan is not free. It has a huge amount of statutory obligations. And I remember the last development plan and the development plan before that, and there were restrictions there. But I've never seen so much policy in the last period of time. And every single time you go to start drafting something like this, it's somebody has taken most of the jigsaw puzzle and put it somewhere else and said, right, now you've got this little bit in the middle and you can work around it. We have a national planning framework. We have a regional strategy. We've got a statutory-based local community and economic plan. The climate action plan that Andrew was talking about, it's there, it's in place. We're looking at a new climate action bill going through the Oireachtas at the moment that will change the climate action plan. So you're planning on a treadmill that's moving somewhere else, not where you can. The Transport Authority determine what the transport policies for the city are, not the development plan, and that you have to fit into them. Bus Connects is now, it'll be delivered, and the start point will be at the beginning of this development plan. Strategic housing is due to end this year, but it was due to end 2 years ago, and we don't know where that's going. The same thing in the housing strategy, and watching the development plan over the last 3 development plans, the councillors and the council executive worked through a lot of really difficult discussions about what the height strategy should be in the city and the apartment standards in the city. And in the last 6 years, the apartment standards have been lessened by the government, and the height strategy has been completely and utterly abolished. And literally you could build a 90-story building in Stony Batter if you really wanted to, according to those guidelines. Now, good planning would say you shouldn't, but we have a lot of issues there on that one. The guidelines for a development plan are set out. The word guideline thinks you can do what you please, you can't. They're mandatory, okay? And there are quite a lot of guidelines in place now. And I'm trying to keep up with them. The guidelines for housing has changed 3 times in the last 5 years, okay? And that's before you start to write. That's before you start doing. And listening to the planners in the city council, when they're talking about this, you feel that you should just lie down and leave it alone. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Right. I think this kind of thing is like, it's, you know, this thing of painting by numbers, where the number is and you fill a color in. Sometimes it's a bit like this. And when you see everything that's predetermined, you wonder how much color you can actually have. The key skill in terms of planning is manipulating those numbers and seeing how much you can pull them, and try to make a framework that you can actually do real development in, okay? Overcome some of the restrictions and work with the restrictions. You have to realize that if you break those restrictions, it goes to the planning regulator, which we've heard about earlier on, incredibly powerful, and he has sent a number of development plans back to local authorities and say, you've broken this, you can't do that, do it again. So, but this one gives you a chance to vision your city. And that 20-year horizon vision fitting into a 6-year place gives you plenty of grounds for saying all the things you want, a good employment at the right place, retail in the right place, and working with the National Transport Authority to deliver things faster, more walking, more cycling. Can we go to the next one? The big issues that are facing this particular plan: housing. Okay, we know there's a crisis. In the National Planning Framework for 2040, it's a 20-year horizon, which is where we're looking at. Ireland is going to grow by 1 million people, okay? Dublin is going to grow by 250,000. And that's on top of our current need. That's 115,000 housing units in the 20-year period. That's about 7,000 or 8,000 housing units every year. And we've failed to meet them for the last 4 or 5 years. So we're building up a real problem here. The other thing that we're looking for is compact development. And this is about condensed development and looking at gaps inside the city rather than pushing people outside the city. Huge need for regeneration. Andrew was talking very much about climate change adaptations and making your houses more comfortable to live in. But in terms of certain areas we have built and left unfinished, parts of Ballymun are unfinished, parts of Finglas, parts of Drimna are unfinished. A huge plan around the Naas Road working with South County Dublin. So there's a lot of action to be put into this development plan. And the adaptation of our climate is really difficult. Since COVID has come, the Parks Department have been greening different parts of the city and doing it as quickly as money will allow. But this suddenly becomes critically important. Fabulous plans out for the Champs-Élysées and the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and really ambitious. And it'll be lovely to see that level of ambition coming into our city. It's also critically important for biodiversity and flood protection, getting the right quantity of water. If we don't have water coming into the city, we don't have development. And there's some very big national decisions to be taking place on this. The night economy and the arts, bringing excitement into the city, making it a living place, not for teenagers, but for everybody. So that it's a family orientated city that's good for young kids, that's good for older people, that's good for absolutely everything. And this concept of a dynamic economy. We're a small city, we've boxed way above our weight in lots of areas, but this is really, really important to us that we get this right. We have to make it good for age and diversity, inclusivity, and that level of connectivity. if we build things in the wrong place, the costs of actually making them work and connect are really, really expensive. So thinking this out and doing it in an order is really, really important. We've never managed to do things in the correct order because we've been very developer-led. Okay, developers come with a plan. This is what we're going to do. We've seen developments come now, the Hendrons site, Phibsborough, dotted all over the place, huge, tall monuments that are really expensive to build, that will take a very long time and will not deliver the housing that we require. And it's important in some ways that the city push back on this and say, this is what we want, and this is the type of city we want. And that will give the strength to actually stand up to a level of developers. There is a new kid on the block, the Land Development Agency, and they're looking to take all public land into there and develop it themselves. They're going to become statutory. The council will have to work with them. You may not like what's going to be done, but I think the level of writing the right stuff into the development plan may force you into a really positive engagement with them. I don't know. They're new, and we'll see how it goes. Last January, they had 8 staff. They hired their 50th 2 months ago. So this is an agency that is actually probably will have teeth. But the problem when you do the development plan, and I'm finishing on this one, is that you write it for 6 years, and the changes that happen in the middle, like a Brexit, like a COVID, you can't plan for. So your development plan will never fully be delivered, but it has to be rolling and it has to be flexible to allow you to deal with things like this. And that's it. Leave it to you now, Joe.
Thank you very much, Audrey. That's a real tour de force, covered lots and lots of areas. And I think you've hit on one of the issues that we have to deal with, and that is that we don't have an absolute control over the development plan. This is both national, there's a national element to it, there's a regional element to it, and we're dealing with the local element, if you like, the Dublin City Council element, and that there are ministerial guidelines that we have to adhere to. Unfortunately, they're statutory. So that's, and the most local one is the Land Development Agency, what that's proposing to do. And there's a number of questions coming in on that indeed. So we'll come to those later. But I have our last, thank you very much, Audrey, and I have our last speaker tonight, and that's Councillor Declan Mina. Declan is a Labour councillor for the Capital Glasnevin area, colleague of mine indeed. And Dex, you wouldn't really think it, but Declan has a severe visual impairment. He's legally blind, and he has overcome that disability extraordinarily successfully. Declan is a tech wizard, and when there's any problems, I always go to Declan, and he's going to speak to us about accessibility issues and issues related to impairment and so on. Declan.
Okay, thanks, Joe, and thanks for the invitation and for bringing this together, and to the previous speakers for what's been some very interesting comments. I suppose I'm going to sum up in a way that links this all together through the lens of accessibility, but in a way that's very universal. And I think if we think about this development plan through disability, we also think about, well, how do we make this whole city just more accessible for everyone? So the arts, I think, is a very important thing. And I've actually been talking to a lot of people with disabilities about the arts, and, you know, I'm talking to people who are active in the arts. A lot of these spaces that we have arts events are not accessible, and that's really unfortunate, because I've also taken part in arts groups where people with disabilities have really found it useful to participate, and their participation has been blocked because the limited space we have for arts sometimes tends to be inaccessible. So we do need to think about that, and that's something I think we can put in the development plan. But for arts venues, it's just about having enough money to have enough space to be accessible. We also then, that leads into the nighttime economy, because I think that needs to be, and we have to think about, first of all, it doesn't have to be just about alcohol. It can also be, there can be coffee shops, there can be non-alcoholic venues, but it should be inclusive of everyone. and it should also be a good place for people to work. And then we have other events around the city, like our parks, and I think they're quite good. And, you know, we have some initiatives like on our beaches where there's, you know, beach wheelchairs and different things like that. But we should look at the adult education, or sorry, adult exercise equipment and the playgrounds, and just think, well, you know, if someone with a wheelchair or someone with different abilities would like to take part in these, what can we do there? So for climate change, and there's been a lot of discussion around cyclists and accessibility, and e-bikes are very interesting because on the one hand, for someone with reduced mobility, e-bikes can open up cycling to them, and that's a really positive. For people who are walking though with limited sight, e-bikes don't make a lot of noise and move very fast. So when we're talking about segregated cycle lanes, that's really good, but we need it to be segregated from the pedestrians as well as from the cars. And I think that can be done. You know, I think the cyclists can be happy and the pedestrians can be happy. And I think that's quite achievable. The transportation, sorry, back to bikes, the Dublin bike scheme, that's a really good scheme. And one of the reasons it's good is because it has set stations where you can put the bikes. You step down onto the road in a safe way, get the bike and go on. We also have, though, stationless bikes and bike rental schemes. Now, what that means is we're adding to the problem of too many bikes and not enough places to park them. And that means that the bikes become a trip hazard. So I think we need to look at that again and think, actually, let's go back to the stations for the bikes and let's go back to expanding the Dublin bike scheme. And the real disaster that's on the horizon are these e-scooters. And if individuals want to own e-scooters, that's fine. But a stationless e-scooter rental will effectively plaster the city in trip hazards. And that's incredibly dangerous and incredibly worrying. So we need to look at that. So climate change, and one of the things we need to look at is provision of trees and possibly improving urban forests, because I was just reading a book today and it was talking about the mental health benefits of forests. And we also need to think about air quality and people who have breathing difficulties and the negative impact of air quality. So really, you know, we are quite lucky and, you know, we're right next to the Phoenix Park, but obviously there's a lot more to be done. And I think we should be thinking about how do we plant more trees? How do we maybe develop smaller urban forests? For numerous reasons, for the mental health benefits, for air quality. Housing is important and we need to try and maximize the amount of accessible housing there is. And sadly, at the moment, the biggest barrier to housing access probably is the unaffordability. And, you know, there aren't many people with disabilities who can afford luxury penthouses, and yet that seems to be, you know, some of the apartments that's, you know, what's been built. So we need to think about that again. We need to think about some of the shoeboxes that are being built and called apartments and think, well, how would a wheelchair get around that? Or if someone buys that apartment and then ends up in a wheelchair, how they get around their home. So that is a very serious thing we need to think about in the development plan. So in terms of employment, again, workplaces, if the workplace is inaccessible, someone isn't going to be able to have a job. And it, you know, access to employment is going to be a massive issue. Probably not a lot we can do in the development plan, but if we think about making workplaces accessible, that's a good start. There's been a lot of removal of public benches. And I think that's very unfortunate because maybe people don't realize that a bench is an accessibility issue. A lot of people have hidden disabilities that limit how fast they can walk or how long they can walk. And you know, regular benches can literally expand how long a person can walk. So having benches is a really nice thing to have in the city. I know the weather doesn't always promote it, but when it does, it's lovely to sit down. But for the people who need them for accessibility, I think we need an extra special effort on these. And doubly so for public toilets. There's a lot of conditions out there that people may have, you know, bowel conditions where, you know, you just need you need easy access to the toilet. You know, women who are pregnant, there's a lot of situations where these are needed and we just don't seem to provide them in the city. And that just absolutely has to change. We need public toilets. It's an accessibility, it's just a dignity and comfort issue as well, but it's definitely an accessibility issue. And I suppose just the last thing I want to say is for everyone, it's important to take part in this process. And I hope that we will be able to get a development plan that can continue some of the good practice and accessibility, but also can improve it and make our city universally accessible, and just a better city for everyone to live. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Declan. You kept well within the time, but the only one, but thanks very much for doing so. And again, thanks very much for focusing on those disability and accessibility issues. Sometimes we think about development and all the infrastructure and all the other things that can be done. But if elderly people and people with any sort of disability can't access them, well, then they're not much use. And that must be incorporated into any integrated plan. So that's all our speakers, and I think they've given us a very good picture of many of the issues, not all of the issues, but many of the issues that we're facing when we look at developing, planning the city, planning the future of the city, looking at the challenges that are there and how we might overcome them. And a number of questions are coming in, and keep the questions coming. So I'll take them as they arrive, if you don't mind, and address them to our panel. So our panel can indicate themselves if they'd like to answer the questions. I'll take the first three that came in, just give people's first names. Patricia has two questions. She says that the SHDs are causing havoc in local areas and they take no notice of LAPs, local area plans, etc. So that's a housing issue, I suppose. Alison might look at that. She also raises the issue of Dublin bikes, that they need to be extended out into the suburbs and why we don't have more of them out in the suburban area. Mags and Aoife raised the issue of space for children in playgrounds. They only go up to the age of 6. We need more activities for the over 6-year-olds. All the flats complexes, there's no facilities for over 6-year-olds. That's the fourth question. And then Roisin Pringle Reid says, is there scope to develop upon the nightlife in Dublin, which is arguable on the most at-risk sector, one of the most at-risk sectors with COVID? The nightlife needs to extend past the hours of 2 to 4 a.m. In cities like Berlin, old industrial buildings and multi-use buildings are used. So there's a first selection of questions, plenty more here. So maybe we would ask Alison to address the SHDs, the strategic housing developments.
Yeah, thanks very much for those questions. Yeah, and the strategic housing development and the urban form and height guidelines are two of the key pieces of legislation that have concerned us since their introduction. And as I mentioned in my presentation, they do ride roughshod over our development plan, which I think you can gather is a plan that we very much consider from a sustainable perspective. The SHD process is incredibly undemocratic because the only recourse anyone has is to take a judicial review. And that judicial review only actually looks at the process as opposed to the outcome. The minister has indicated that at the end of this year that they'll review it. But there was a previous review, I think 18 months ago, I made a submission, pointed out how undemocratic it was and how at a local level, it does not contribute to sustainable planning. So I'm afraid that's one definitely for our Oireachtas members to challenge. And I know our Labour Senator, Rebecca Moynihan, is very much on that. The same with the urban form and height guidelines. And it's all about the integrity of our development plan. And I know from our own perspective, we can get very frustrated that we put all of this work in and all of this consideration in, and it can be just ignored by someone signing legislation that basically thinks that if you can build high enough, that you will get the housing we need. And I think the city has shown that that's not the case. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Marie, perhaps you might address the issue of the children's playgrounds and child facilities.
Yeah, and first just to say, and I've no doubt Andrew will have something to say on the Dublin bikes, but it's been a huge source of frustration to me, the reluctance, not even reluctance, but the resistance by the National Transport Authority to sanction the development of Dublin bike stations beyond the North Circular Road on the north side. And you know, they offer the issue of cost. As the further out you go, the more costly it becomes to maintain. But Declan makes extremely valid points about that if you have other stationless bikes, you're taking up valuable parking space for other bikes, and of course trip hazards and all of that. So I think that is a huge source of frustration with regards to the desire to expand Dublin bikes, but the resistance to it. On the playgrounds, I think there's a very real issue with regards to, in particular, the development of playground facilities for those with additional needs. We have seen this done very successfully in other cities around the country. As I understand it, the numbers are quite small in Dublin City Council. Any new infrastructure put in is what they call, comes to a universal design standard, that it can be used by children who've got additional mobility or particular behavioural needs. But I think there is a very real issue, and this isn't just confined to Dublin, but in terms of what facilities and amenities are in place for those who are just under the age of 10 and over the age of 10 up until they're 15 or 16. And that, you know, there's a huge gap there going from, you know, young children into early adulthood or teenagers, and we haven't been great as a city on that. Just the last thing I just want to say, and I know there was a question raised there about the nightlife, and you know, it was a very clear part of our the Dublin Agreement when I was the councillor, that we had a very clear commitment to the development of night commissioners. I know other parties talk about night czars, but night commissioners are a nightmare, to develop the night economy. And again, going back to that point about gaps, like as in we don't have a developed night economy or facility for those who are underage, but yet maybe, you know, in Dublin city centre or in parts of our city, you know, in the evening time. And so it is about licensing, looking at that, but it's looking at safe spaces. It's looking at the openness of cultural and sporting amenities beyond their usual hours. I think there's a whole variety of issues there, and certainly I think it's really important that there would be a number of night commissioners looking at this and bringing forward proposals to the City Council. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marie. I suppose the question to you, Andrew, about the Dublin bikes, why aren't they extended into the suburbs? I think you sort of suggested an answer to it already, but
yeah, well, there's a couple of things. Couple of things about the Dublin bikes. First of all, I have seen plans to double the number of bikes and to double the number of stations. So the plans are there and they've been passed around for the last 2 or 3 years, and nobody's acting on them. So I really like to see some action on this. Marie talks about the NTA saying that it's difficult to move the bikes around. One of the challenges is with the system is that the bikes are most needed at rush hour, and yet the trucks that move the bikes around aren't allowed to use the bus lanes. Now, for me, the Dublin Bike Scheme is part of our public transport system, and those moving vans should be allowed to shift the bikes from one part of the city to another, and that would allow the scheme to work. And so they're saying that, oh, it's difficult to move them around. There's a way to deal with that problem. It's part of our public transport infrastructure. I know that when the bikes came in, that when they first came in, like the Lewis didn't want to have anything to do with them, didn't want to have Dublin bike stations near them. But they very quickly changed their mind because they realized that the Dublin bikes makes the whole Lewis scheme and the whole DART scheme far more workable, because somebody can arrive in a DART station, say at Tara Street, but might be working in a different part of the city. They can finish their journey off on a Dublin bike, and they've now started to integrate the stations in with Lewis stops and things like that. So for the very same reason, the bikes should be moved around because they are part of our public transport scheme. They make the whole system work much better. And I don't understand why. It's one of the things I was on to Eamon Ryan. I don't understand why he hasn't taken up the cudgels on behalf of Dublin bike users.
Very good. Actually, Patricia has come back on that and says that we don't have the bikes. We don't know when we're going to get those bikes in suburban areas, but we do have the huge advertisement stands. So they're getting what's paying for the bikes, but they're not getting the bikes.
Yeah, well, I would love to see those bikes out in Santry and in Ballymun, Finglas, Drumcondra, all parts of the city that desperately need that kind of service.
Yeah, Joe, can I just come in there? I completely agree with it. And I think we've got a very good opportunity now under the call, under the Recovery and Resilience European Fund, the grants for that. And it's very much targeting at digital, climate and sustainability. And I've asked Richard Shakespeare to include an extension of the Dublin bikes to it. It's something, the time scale for that fund is really, really tight. It's a 3-year turnaround. As Andrew said, we have the plans, we have the system in place, and I think it's something that could very much deliver that short-term time frame for us. So I would hope that we would be included in funding for that if it's not coming centrally or through the NTA.
Alison, just briefly on that, so the government have that out for consultation, so individuals can actually make a submission and say they'd like that included in the Recovery and Resilience Fund. So it's something I think everyone on the call, if you want extension of Dublin bikes, go onto the government website, make an observation for that and say that you want Dublin bikes included in the government's submission on it. I think it's a great idea we can all take up and push for.
Okay. Tell us, Jack, you didn't want to come in on the nightlife. Is that cultural or... You're on mute. Yeah. You're still on mute, Jack.
Now,
Jack.
Yeah, I think it could be cultural and should be cultural. And I take the point that we need to reimagine nightlife, really. You know, it's at the moment, it's just come the nighttime, the whole city erupts into a mad place. And it's certainly not family friendly at all. And that's what we need to think about. You know, I know there's the pub culture and that's sort of dominates everything, but we need to, as I say, reimagine what can happen. And certainly the opening hours of cultural institutions of one sort or another, that should be looked at again. And there's no reason why they can't stay open much longer. A lot of other things, you know, the places have to be made safe, and maybe we just need to... Audrey, you might have other ideas about that.
Audrey, you're on mute too.
Yeah, no, I have. I mean, I think that the night economy is so undervalued in terms of what can be done. And it doesn't have to be everything into the city centre. I was laughing there at you saying about a pub culture. I can't remember what one of them looks like. But God live the day for that on the vaccine. But I think that the thing that's key on this one is in terms of venues. If U2 came now, I'm not sure they'd have anywhere to play. We've closed off a lot of really good things where artists could actually develop. And we've now a very diverse city, whether it be the LGBT community or whether it be people from loads of different countries and things like that. And all we had in the past was that pub culture, and we need to have something completely and utterly different. There is no rationale galleries have to close at certain times. There's no rationale why we can't have performances and open the whole thing up. But we have to make the city safe at that stage. And that idea of having a person come in there to actually help organize that would be really, really critically important. But can I do 2 quick things on playgrounds and things like that? Brilliant in the parks, and the parks have been magnificent in COVID. But nobody looks at the needs of teenagers. We've never got that one right. And we just don't develop anything at that stage. And that's where we run into a lot of trouble. And the strategic housing stuff, I get the point on the democracy and I completely agree with it, but this is a developer's paradise. that they can skip a lot of consultation. It's a lot more work at the city council, but it is developer led. Come do what you want, and here we go. And if it's okay planning wise, and it's okay and things, everything can happen. And we will lose all these spaces that we want for a nightlife and for everything else. And then we'll say you can't have noise. I mean, that was a big problem with Smithfield, you know, just in terms of what we want to develop as a city and make it livable. Really, really important.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I notice already that we're an hour and a half, so I don't want to prolong it too much. But what I'll do is I'll go through, and some of these I haven't looked at at all, but I'll go through a series of questions that have come in, and maybe you take a note of it and people can come in as they please at the end of it. That'll be the last roundup. So first of all, yeah, this is Michael says, I agree, there seems to be little for young adults, especially if you aren't into sports. Des says 2027, is it? Is the 60th anniversary year of the first Dublin City Development Plan, a plan that was exhibited publicly in the Black Church. That's interesting. Perhaps the 60 years of urban planning might be marked in some way. Well, if it's 2027, we have ways to go yet. We have time to work on it. Michael says tourism creates opportunities for the less educated and could potentially boost the black spots mentioned in the report. Examples of this is now seen in Detroit, where private grassroots work directly with council and state grants to create new and innovative ventures. Logan says rising juvenile crime rates must be taken into account with thefts of bicycles, etc. Knife crime, it'll be even worse with electric bicycles. Well, health, safety and security measures to be improved. Another Michael says tourism creates opportunities for the less educated and could potentially boost black spots mentioned in the report. Right. Patricia agrees with Marie about the bike scheme. Continue being told that there is no way we will ever get the bikes. There you are. And Pat raises the question of the Land Development Agency. And she says very starkly, before councillors take part in any stage of this draft, why are they not challenging the recent removal of their very rights to participate, including the current minister's effort to remove their rights to challenge transfer of public or council properties to the Housing Development Agency? I'll have a word or two to say about that, and I'm sure Alison has plenty to say about it too. Emer says, also the need to increase apartment housing sizes in post-COVID era. Apartment and housing size. With so many people working from home, important that standards are improved to ensure sufficient space, light, public open space and private open space. Build to rent is not allowing people to buy and settle into an area. How can we control the number of build to rent student co-living units? These can lead to very transient populations. While new co-living units now prohibited, the number of build to rents is increasing. Need to develop housing for families, need to ensure developments deliver Part 5 at affordable rates for local authorities. Michael says Dublin is today roughly where Copenhagen was 15 years ago. Their focus on multiple strands of transport and drastic reduction in private cars within the city centre has led to more areas where retail and tourism can grow. E.g., Dublin does not exploit the river as other cities do. We're not nearly finished yet. Julianne says, are there town planners or people researching the demographics of the current population and future populations so that a practical development plan can be made? For example, if there is a projected amount of future families in an area, will there be enough schools in the area or enough childcare facilities provided for them? If a large development goes ahead, say like the Crosscombs, they are proposing to use, that's Fitzroy development, proposing to use existing childcare facilities in the area that are already at maximum capacity. Letting a horribly high dense proposal like that to go ahead is bad planning, as there's not the infrastructure to support that sort of development. And this question here from Pádraig about the arts, designated cultural spaces like Sean O'Casey Centre or Gardner Street? And what about the Parnell Square designated cultural quarter? Could that be used for providing spaces and accommodation? Logan again says, no, it's rising. Yeah, same one I've read. And Julianne says, absolutely Declan. So why are they trying to cut down trees for bus lanes?
I objected to that.
And Patricia says, bus connects would totally denude Navan Road from Ashtown roundabout to Caver Cross. That's off trees.
Yeah.
And I think this is the last one I have here. This from Des. Teenagers, Dublin Youth Theatre recently became homeless after 40 years in Upper Gardner Street. It's currently in very temporary accommodation off Harcourt Street and looking for a permanent home. So these are all the questions that they're still coming in, but I have at the moment. There's a great response. Thank you to everybody who were in attendance and who have responded. So perhaps we would have a quick word from all our panel. And because the youth theatre, hold on, there's another one. Michael says, could we create local Wi-Fi hubs so that people can do flexible work without having to communicate? So maybe I'll start with Jack there, because that last one was on the Dublin Youth Theatre, and there was a number of suggestions in relation to maybe around cultural areas, that places like Sean O'Casey and Brendan Behan and all the development there in the cultural quarter, that could also have some accommodation and some workplaces and performance places. Jack, you're on mute. And ask everybody to be quick, 2 minutes apiece, and we'll call it a day at that.
I totally agree. The Dublin Youth Theatre was the first one. I happen to have an interest there because I'm on the board, so I have to declare that. But it's a brilliant organisation and would be a brilliant example for anybody who wants to look at what can be done through the arts for young people. And somebody else mentioned earlier, Michael, I think it was, about if you're not interested in sport, there's nothing much else. Now, Dublin Youth Theatre is, as I say, it's a great organisation. It's not just about theatre, it's about development of the whole person. An amazing outfit. So it does need a home, and I hope that can be found. I did mention when I was speaking about Parnell Square, where there had been a plan for a cultural quarter of some sort. And certainly the buildings are there, but there's been a rollback now, and it's just the library is going ahead. So it doesn't augur too well for, what might happen there or anywhere else in the city. But I think we just need more space for artists. Artists should be seen, they should be in the communities, they should be seen by the young people, should be interacting with them, and we'd have a much better society and a better city for it. I think my time is probably up.
Next, loads of housing issues there.
Yeah.
Alison.
Thanks for those questions. Yeah, I'll pick up on just the last point that was made there. I do think it comes down to ideology, and I think it was Fitton O'Toole who wrote a really good piece around the comparison between our investment in sport and the lack of investment in the Parnell Square cultural project. And I think if you look at COVID and the response to COVID as well, there seems to be a favouring of certain sporting activities opening under COVID compared to cultural activities. But that's an aside. On the housing, we had a proposal today at the Housing Policy Committee to have a special meeting to address the Land Development Bill and indeed the Affordable Housing Bill. We've organised a briefing for councillors, and we'll be writing a very strong letter to the Minister, because the fact that he has decided that the Land Development Agency can, I suppose, take away our right to decide what we want to do with our land is disgraceful. But there is a trend there. If you look at the legislation, the central legislation that we spoke about and how it can override our development plan, things are becoming way more centralised. And I do think as a party, we're very strong on local government and strong on local community input into it. We are conducting a housing needs analysis so that it is an evidence-based approach to planning for housing need, whether that be, as I mentioned, the size of the family, the type of housing, and to allow for movement around of people coming into the city, maybe to live or work, and then moving out, so that we do accommodate all of those. We do have to try and get around either curtailing the number of student accommodation, co-living, build to rent in a certain area, because we are seeing a concentration, particularly of student accommodation in Dublin 8, for example, or Dublin 1. The idea of that student accommodation was to get students who are sharing family homes out of those family homes, so those family homes could be occupied by families. But unfortunately, it's become a for-profit enterprise. Huge amount of those in it are international students coming with a lot of money in their pockets, and not your ordinary student who is struggling to pay both fees and accommodation. The multiple strands of transport, again, I think the city is becoming more aware of those needs and pushing for it, and I hope we're more successful in it. Again, it comes down to what we can write a vision into this development plan, but at the end of the day, one of the biggest things that inhibits Dublin City Council is the lack of funding. We are so dependent on grants from central government to do what we want to do, that we are really hamstrung when it comes to proper support for the arts, for example, for community facilities, for childcare. Childcare is a private enterprise. We need full public universal childcare, the same way of the school system. If we had that, then we would have more sustainable planning in that area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. Andrew?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just a couple of comments there. Somebody talked about bike theft, and I think it's a very well made point. Last few bikes I've had so many bikes stolen. I can only use cheap bikes now because I just had too many bikes stolen. And it's a shame, because if you do most of your commuting on a bike, it's nice to have a good quality bike, but it's so hard to maintain that. So especially if people are going to shift to electric bikes, we're going to have to up our game in terms of providing safe spaces for parking. And I know that the council did some work, I did some work myself on providing the car parking space in Drury Street car park. Now, there was 19 car parking spaces on the ground floor there. We removed those 19 car parking spaces and put in 200 bike parking spaces. So it just shows how efficient bike parking can be. So just removing a small number of car parking spaces around the city can make a big difference. And I think maybe we should be doing deals with some of the other car parking stations around the city, because we do have to address that if we're going to encourage people to use electric bikes. The other thing is, of course, if we, as we keep talking about, if we did expand the Dublin Bike Scheme, maybe that wouldn't be such an issue. Bike theft wouldn't be such an issue if people could use a Dublin bike instead. The other thing I just picked up on is somebody talked about the river, how we don't make the most of our river. And I think that's a point very well made. And I think a lot of it's to do with just the heavy traffic we have there. And is that the best we can do on our river there, to have 3-4 lanes of traffic coming down the river? It's just such a hostile, noisy, unpleasant environment. Nobody wants to sit outside a cafe, especially on Bachelor's Walk, that part of the city. The north side of the river is the sunny side of the river, because the sun comes from the south, it shines on the north side. So we should really, do a lot more work on trying to make the north side of the river an attractive place for people to sit outside, coffee shops, to enjoy the amenity there. But it's not an enjoyable space as it is. Thank you,
Andrew. Thank you, Marie.
Thanks, Joe. And look, I'm conscious it's getting late, and I won't delay. But
2 minutes.
Yeah, I think I said at the start of my comments about there's a real potential and opportunity here to be ambitious in our vision for the city, and I'm conscious that there are so many political constraints on Dublin City Council and local authorities right across the country, because so much power is held by by central government and not by the local authorities. But I think there are ways around it. Certainly when I think of the constraint on co-living, and we saw a ban, which wasn't a ban, announced before Christmas, and has the potential to allow just over about 1,096 co-living beds are currently going through the planning system within 1.6 kilometres of a radius of each other within the northwest inner city. Now, it'll be too late by the time the development plan comes along, but certainly in terms of ensuring that we have proper spacing, like for student accommodation, there are rules there. Now, some of them haven't necessarily been upheld, that they have to be a certain distance apart. And the local city council can be creative in shaping the city that we want through the planning system. There's so little of the cards that they do hold. They're not, and certainly in terms of, I want to see the city council building housing directly, but of course it can't do that unless the Custom House actually unlocks the key and allows it to borrow directly. But it can get around, I suppose, some of the issues by ensuring that we have a much stronger and robust planning system. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Marie. And certainly, I think all the councillors will be fighting for the maximum authority in developing this plan. And naturally enough, we want as much support as possible from the office. I'm sure that'll be forthcoming. Thank you. Audrey.
Yeah, just taking back to the Land Development Agency and the interaction with councils and things like this. In some ways, fighting each one of these come up individually is a real problem. Local government, don't take this as a bad thing, is brutal in Ireland. There is no powers for elected members. It has too few functions, and a lot of the functions it has been taken away and put either into quangos or different bodies. And that's part of the problem. I actually think if you keep fighting every little dogfight going around, fight for the big one, a proper local government structure, elected members to the regional authorities and any other body, whether it be the HSE or the Land Development Agency, that councillors are full and front elected members on it. Okay, this thing of actually appointing bodies to do a bidding elsewhere is a real bugbear of mine. While they can be very efficient at what they do, it has no bearing on the concept of delivering local service in a local area. Somebody said about 60 years of planning, we should do something to commemorate it. Absolutely, we should take the planning system we have apart, take it, put it in a bin and move on to something that's a little bit more user-friendly and not developer-led. And that actually is led by need rather than somebody's profit somewhere else. And it possibly reacts to our difficulties in getting what we want. Everybody is talking about wanting housing and need and apartments, and what we're getting is student accommodation, shared accommodation, and a whole range of different things. I don't have a problem with some build to rent. I actually think it's a NAD, but a build to rent where it's shared accommodation is something I have a lot of problems with. I think there has to be a proper mix. The state has walked off the pitch in terms of building houses and just left it to a free market system, and then a couple of bits here and there all over the place. And I really think that's a real problem. Apartment sizes, my goodness, the city had really good apartment sizes and they got overturned in the last development plan. If I want to go and live in an apartment after COVID, my house is now a multifunctional organization here, from government departments to universities to everything else working out of this unit here. If I was living in a tiny apartment, I think I would have jumped out the window. And probably on the last point I would make, that thing of actually creating Wi-Fi everywhere. I know it's a good idea, but I'd smash one if I saw one, because I want to get away from Wi-Fi for about a year after this thing is over and never see a television screen ever again. That's all I want to say. You're on mute, Joe. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I was saying, Audrey, that's a good note to finish on, but the last word goes to Declan before I wind up.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joe. And I suppose I will be a bit grim to start with, and then I'll be a bit more positive. I think just going back to the childcare things, like I just the whole SHD process, and I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to process, and it is appalling. And we have to think about our city in terms of how are we going to get more density? Can we get height? And there's places in our city where we can have height. I've been to places in Europe, in other parts of Europe, where there's been a lovely tall apartment block surrounded by really nice trees. And just the whole thing works really well. And even walking around outside it, it doesn't feel like you're in a massive city. But then we come over here and we come to, developers who are trying to think, they would literally have capsule hotels as and sell them as apartments if they were let away with it. And it's just incredibly disappointing. For people who are faced with the unsustainable SHDs, it's important to note that you can make an online observation to onboard Planola, and that was released over Christmas without much fanfare. So just remember that. And it is worth making observations on them. I think when we have areas, and I want to welcome particularly people to this meeting from Pelletstown, where we've actually got places with density. Unfortunately, they haven't been very well served with the development plan. They've been hounded with SHDs. At the moment, the school has part of the playground on the roof. And I just think when we do have areas like this that are mixed development, we need to do better. And I think that's one area we can do within the plan. But the discussion around where work's going in the future, I actually think our city can do quite a lot. And one of the things I would like to see has been mentioned is working spaces, because after COVID, the last thing people are going to want to do is go back to a massive congested commute. And one of the ways people are going to look at that is actually to leave Dublin. And there's, anecdotal evidence anyway of anyone who can is working outside Dublin. And we have to actually stand up for Dublin and say, okay, well, we want to go back to a city that people want to work in. So one of the solutions is to have shared working spaces in the suburbs so people can have 5-10 minute commute, which I think would be a really nice city. And when we talk about this idea of a 15-minute city, it has to be an inclusive 15-minute city. It has to be a 15-minute city for everyone. But I think there's a lot to think about there, and to think about, can we bring more of these jobs in? And then also with the city, can we reinvigorate living over the shops for people so there's actually more housing? Because there's 3-4 floors in those shops that aren't used. So there's a lot of hope in this. And I just, for the early stage, I think maybe don't be too worried about the technical detail, but just everyone should write in and say what they want their city to be. And let's hope we can actually work together and build back a city after COVID that's much better. And I think that is achievable if we're optimistic and if we all work together on it. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
Joe, you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you all very much thank you, Declan. Thank you all for those wonderful contributions. I'll just read the last two queries that came in. Corporations, this is from somebody in the corporate sector, says corporations are screaming out for opportunities to engage through their environmental, social and corporate governance strategies. So there should be plenty of part funding to be found for youth in that area. Maybe we aren't using the corporate sector enough in terms of corporate responsibility and putting proper funding into development purposes, particularly for youth. And the last question I have here is from Michael in Denmark. And he says, see what they did with Copenhagen Harbour and canals. That would be a good example for the LIFE. So we've had over 50 people participate on the website and Facebook, so that's been very good. Thank you all very much for your attendance and your participation. And we have the presentations that were made, and we can send those out to anybody who wants to contact me by email or Facebook or whatever method of messaging. I'm sure we'll be able to put them all together and send them out to people, anybody who wants them. We will be doing a submission. I'll certainly be doing a submission to the development plan. This is the first stage. and this broad type policy submission has to be in by the 22nd of February. But of course, anybody can send in their own submissions. That's not a problem. But certainly, if anybody wishes to send on some ideas, and the ideas coming out of this meeting would be incorporated into a joint submission, which would be going in. And could I finally say that one of the things that I have always considered is that the motto of the City Council has always been wrong. It says that the obedience of the citizens is the happiness of the city. I've always felt that that's putting the cart before the horse. It's really the citizens, the engagement of the citizens that makes the city happy and a useful place. And the development plan is about engagement. It's about participation. It's about the citizens deciding what their vision is going to be for the future of their city. And I think it's time for us to rewrite the motto. So with the help of all our contributors, our panelists today, we're beginning that process. So I want to thank Jack and Alison and Andrew and Marie and Audrey and Declan for excellent contributions tonight. And I want finally to thank our audience for persisting with us. And I hope that they've enjoyed it and they've got something useful out of it. So finally, thank you once again and good night.